Hey, it's Rachel, and today we're going to show you how we transformed waterlogged heavy clay sod into decent soil without having to go out and buy anything. And in an ideal universe, we would all be gardening in pure compost because healthy soil is really, really important. It's the basis for how often you have to water, how often you have to fertilize, and whether your plants are going to be stressed and subject to diseases and pests. But for a lot of us, especially right now, it's just not possible to go and buy a bunch of amendments or compost. So we thought we'd show how you can do this without purchasing anything and just working with what you've got to get yourself into a decent gardening situation. So if that's a need of yours, stay tuned and we'll show you how we did it. This is the fifth video in our series on how to build a backyard garden from scratch. We started with the location and where to site your garden. We talked about how to decide what to grow and what works best for your family. I did a really detailed video outlining my process for laying out the garden step by step and what goes where. And then our last video, we focused on the raised bed construction process, including how we integrated some pest control. And in that video, Winston mentioned that we were only using 2x6 lumber, and one of the ways we were going to ensure we had sufficient depth was by working the soil beneath the beds. So what we're going to do today is walk you through the process by which we made sure that we got decent soil. And our next video will be on the planting process itself. And in that, I will talk about a couple of things that we bring up in this video in terms of limitations around the soil and how we're going to get around that as we do the planting itself. So if you want to get notifications as we post the next video in the series, go ahead and subscribe and you'll be notified as we put those up. So to start, what do I mean when I say that we have heavy clay soil? Pulling up, soil is composed of three basic components. There's clay, there's silt, and there's sand. And the mix of those three different things tells you what kind of soil you have. Clay has the smallest particle size. It's really high in mineral content, which is great. It helps with water retention, which is great. But it can also plate together in this really compact form. And when that happens, if you have too much clay in your soil and it starts to clump together, you get drainage issues. It also, when it dries out, becomes rock hard and really hard to work, and you can end up damaging the structure of your soil if you try and work it when it's wet, especially if it's got clay. The other end of the spectrum is sand. So sand is the largest particle size. And if you have a lot of sand, too much sand, the problem can be the opposite. Water drains through really, really quickly, nutrients leach out really, really fast, and you can't retain moisture and you can't retain enough nutrients. Some sand is really important for drainage. Too much of it is a bad thing, just like with clay. And then in the middle is silt, kind of the medium particle size. And those essentially all work together to create your soil type. So ideally, right, the soil mix that you want to have is what we would call loam. That's roughly 25% clay, and then anywhere from 25 to 50% silt and 25 to 50% sand. And I'll walk through how you can quickly figure out what kind of soil you have. Understanding this can help you anticipate whether you might have some issues, and if so, what those might be and how best to address them. So the simple way to do this is the mason jar soil test. And to execute it, you go out to your garden area where you plan to go and put your vegetables, and you dig a few different samples. You want to go about 9 inches deep into the soil where kind of your roots are going to be living. And dig a few of these, mix them all together to get a representative sample size, and then fill a mason jar about halfway full with that soil blend. You fill the rest of it with water, screw the lid on, and give it a really, really good shake until all of the particles are suspended in the water. And then let it sit and settle. And what will happen, and you can see a picture here of the one that I did for our garden, is that the small particles in the clay land last, and the heavy particles from the sand land first, with the silt in between. So your bottom layer, as these kind of start to settle and form these nice stripes and layers, the bottom will be the sand, the middle is your silt, and the top is your clay. You can mark it, as I did here, with a dry erase marker to kind of see the boundaries in those different levels. And then you can go through with a ruler held up next to it and just measure the respective heights. And in my case, we had a total of 2 inches of soil after it had all settled. And the bottom layer of sand was 7/8 of an inch. I had 1/8 of an inch of silt, and I had a solid inch of clay. So not surprising to me, because I'd already seen the drainage issues, as mentioned earlier. we had a really high clay content. So we're like 50% clay, 6% silt, and 44% sand. So there's a handy graph that you can use to understand your soil type based on what you see in your mason jar. And I'll put a link to it down below, but I'm also just going to do a quick step-by-step of how you lay out this triangle chart. And I'll use just my soil as an example. So this chart has 3 dimensions, so 3 different axes, and you use them to show what percentage you had of your 3 components. So I'll start by showing clay. So I go up to the 50% mark here on the side and draw a horizontal line over at the 50% line. When I then look at the sand, which was my bottom axis, I go ahead and I find roughly 44%, so I went halfway between the 40 and the 50 here. And you draw a line up vertically to the left to all the way across and intersect with where your clay line was. And then you go on your right axis, which is the silt, and I went all the way to the top because I only have 6%, and draw a line down left from there, parallel with those. And you can see where all 3 of these intersect is your soil type. And I mentioned before, what you want is loam, which is kind of like right in that bottom center. In my case, I'm sort of way up in the top and kind of to the left. I'm in the clay category, which was not a surprise to me. But when you look at this, you can start to get a sense for what to do about it. The good news is that in almost all instances, adding organic matter is the answer. So if you have a whole lot of sand and you're not going to retain water very well, adding some organic content, especially compost, but raw materials like leaves, grass, people put animal manures in, any kind of organic content you have access to that you can get into your soil, that will help almost act like a glue and hold together those sand particles and really improve your moisture retention and therefore your nutrient retention. In my case, with heavy clay soil, it also helps to add organic content. As that organic matter gets worked through the soil by the recomposers like worms and the little microbial life down in the soil, that will incorporate in and it'll break up some of that heavy clay and improve drainage. So we knew right away that we wanted to add organic content. In our case, we have a second goal, which is, as I mentioned in the site selection video, there really aren't any good spots in the backyard that don't have too much moisture. Because of the berm behind me, it really concentrates that moisture down into the backyard and it's always wet. So as we dug, it's really obvious we had this standing water down below. And our goal was not just to improve the drainage, but also to sop up some of that water. So I have a diagram here, very simplistic kind of cartoonish diagram that I put together that shows the situation. So we have grass that was put in by the builder that developed this subdivision, and it's on a really thin layer of topsoil. And right below that is just all this heavy clay. And what happens when it rains is you can actually see water rising up and standing water in the grass itself. So the drainage is obviously really poor. Our goal with adding organic content and sopping up water, we actually took a cue from a technique called hugelkultur. And I'll probably try and put a link down to that below with this proper spelling, etc., for those that are interested. But essentially, hugelkultur is building a large mound out of sticks and twigs and logs that you then cover in soil and you plant into that. And as those logs break down over time, they act as a sponge absorbing the water. And then as they break down, they add organic matter to the soil and they improve the texture. And we weren't going to go full hugelkultur here, but we did sort of a mini or light version of it. And so I have another diagram here showing kind of the concept we were trying to do, which is to get some really small diameter, like 2 to 3 millimeter diameter twigs, and put them down into the wet area so that they could soak up some of that water and act like a sponge. On top of that, we put a layer of dried leaves to get some more organic content that would break down a little bit faster than those twigs would. And then above that, we simply flipped our sod over on top of it. And the reason is that the grass that was on top is now inverted. So 1, it kills the grass, which is helpful. But 2, that grass is a good nitrogen source and it's now mixed in with these dried leaves. And the thought was they can compost in place. You get a pretty good mix of carbon and nitrogen in there and you can get the composting process kicked off. Now this meant that the clay ends up on top. And so on top of that, we then put a thin layer of compost that we already had available on hand because it had a really good healthy worm population in it. And our thought was get the worms up in that thin layer, they'll start working their way down through the clay and into the leaves and into that dead grass, and hopefully they can start really working all those layers together. because with wet clay sod, we weren't going to till this, we weren't going to mechanically churn it. I generally try not to do that anyway, but it would have been disastrous to do it with wet clay. So we were trying to physically manipulate the soil as little as possible. And the idea of putting in organic content and then just flipping it on top meant that we didn't have to work it too much and make it too stiff and frozen. So that was the plan. Worth noting that the execution is never as clean and simple as what you put in your diagram. So we, in our case, went around our neighborhood, and there'd been one nice sunny day, and our neighbors had all done a bunch of yard work. And so, we stayed 6 feet away during COVID separation, but we did go collect a whole bunch of these bags. And in the process, we pretty quickly figured out who we'd probably be friends with in this neighborhood based on how they reacted to this request. But you can see here, we got a whole bunch of bags, and we had 4 different beds to put it on. These were not homogeneous materials. These were just whatever our neighbors happened to have been doing in their yard. So there was leaves that were picked up, there were some, branch trimmings, there's all kinds of stuff. And so the first thing we did was to loosen and flip over the sod. But then after that, we had to go through these bags and somewhat evenly divide the contents. So try to get a roughly equivalent amount of branches and twigs across the beds and leaves and everything else. We then went through and tried to tuck that organic matter under the sod and did our best to get the twigs and the leaves and the heavier stuff at the bottom, and then the leaves on top. And important to note here, one last consideration is the balance of carbon and nitrogen in your soil. So your living creatures down there, all of the microherds living in the soil, they need both carbon and nitrogen in order to survive and to thrive. Your plants definitely need nitrogen in the soil. And whenever you add too much of just one of those things, it throws the whole system out of balance. If we had been putting pure compost in, they would already have the balance of carbon and nitrogen that's perfect, but we weren't. And when we look at what we added, we put in really quite a bit of carbon in the form of those twigs and the dead leaves, and only a little bit of grass for nitrogen. So we knew that potentially we had just thrown this out of balance, and a lot of our nitrogen was going to get locked up in the soil. So after we had done all of this work, we then went back through a few days later when it was dry and we were able to mow our lawn for the first time, and we put a whole bag of grass clippings per bed, put it on top of this soil, and then covered the whole thing with one of our planting templates. And I'll talk about those more in the next video. And we use these for a lot of reasons, but the one to highlight here is worm activity. Keeping the soil covered up and well secured here, no daylight's getting through, will encourage the worms to come all the way to the surface and really work these grass clippings in. It also prevents the grass clippings from drying out, and that helps with the composting in place process. So you can see here we've got it all tucked away neatly, and it's protected from the elements and from birds. So we should get, hopefully, a really good activity from the worms. So all without buying anything, we were able to achieve 5 inches or so of soil in our raised beds. And then by working what we did in terms of getting that organic content down below, we've also got another 2 to 3 inches of material composting in place below that. And then no barrier between that and the subsoil. So ultimately that gives us, call it 7 to 8 inches of decent soil, which for what we're trying to grow is perfectly adequate. So it's as if we had used much more expensive lumber and built everything up from the ground, but we were able to use what we had on hand, less expensive, shallower 2x6s, and still get decent soil depth. The only thing I might not be able to plant in this is carrots. And so when we decide to put carrots in the fall, I'll probably do a special little short video on how I work the soil to make them a little healthier and a little happier. But for now, for everything we're trying to grow, I think that it's going to work out great. So if you want to get updated on future videos like the carrot planting one, I'm also going to check in throughout the season on how this experiment is going and talk about the soil quality and how the plants are holding up. In the next video, as we talk through the planting out of our summer crops, I'll show you the early results. We did put things like kale and broccoli in the ground a few weeks back, and they're doing really well in this soil mix. So I'll get some images of that so you can see how this experiment is working out so far, about 3-4 weeks in. And then I will also show you as the season progresses, any issues we see with the plants, any extra care we have to do because of this soil. But overall, so far, I would say we're feeling really optimistic about the quality. So if you want to get updated on those videos, definitely go ahead and subscribe, and you'll see those notifications as we put them up. We also will put some more short format videos on, planting tips and tricks, my blend of soil amendments, that kind of stuff, and probably some short little videos on harvesting and pruning throughout the growing season. So if you want to see those, we're probably going to put them on Facebook and Instagram. So you can also check us out there if you want to get access to those. So we would love to hear if anybody has used other free techniques to create soil without having to buy anything. Please definitely comment, let us know what you did. We'd like to get as much information going on this as we can, especially right now. And I would just love to see the creativity. So let us know what you did, and let us know if there's anything you have questions about or any other topics you want us to cover in the next video. Until then, enjoy. Happy growing.